I'm Karen Reich at the Library of Michigan, and this is a webinar on the budget section of our Improving Access to Collections grant. If you've got questions, feel free to unmute and ask them or post them in the chat, but I will get started with the presentation. First thing is, it will be a competitive program. There'll be a limited number of proposals approved. I am estimating somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 is possible for me to spend for next year's budget. So you do have a good chance. Last year, we funded more than half of the applications. So if you're comfortable with your idea and the application, please do apply. We funded 18 for this current year, so that was a good number for us. FYI, grant funds will be available only if the Institute of Museum and Library Services receives a federal appropriation and is able to allot funds to the Library of Michigan. Unfortunately, federal funds don't encumber across fiscal years, so even if I had money left over this year, I can't apply it to next year. So we're waiting. We still don't have an allotment letter for the next fiscal year. We understand that it is coming, but just kind of an FYI, when you hear about Congress having trouble passing a budget and doing continuing resolutions, that means pass-through entities like the Library of Michigan or the Department of Education don't actually have money for next year yet. So we're waiting on our allotment. So the first thing I'm going to say is read the documentation thoroughly, both for the application webinar that I did earlier in the month and this one on the budget. What I talked about in that presentation and this one is included in the application packet. So I tried not to drop into grant jargon too much, but I highly recommend you read the entire application packet. If you have questions about what I meant, feel free to call me or email me. At michigan.gov/LSTA, there's an Improving Access grant section. And on that, there is an information packet for the literacy and digital inclusion priorities. And there is an application packet for the local history and preservation priority. They are different enough that we decided to separate out the information packets for them. So it would be a little more sensible for someone reading just one of them. There is also a current and next year's grant administration manual posted. So if you're like, well, what am I getting into if I apply for this grant? You can skim through the administration manual and see what the expectations are for the grant management. And I also have the timeline posted. There is some additional documentation towards the bottom of the page, which includes crediting IMLS and LM. That is a requirement. People will sometimes send me things that are part of their grant program, and I go, wow, that's lovely, and you need to have the IMLS logo on it. There is a requirement for outcome-based evaluations from IMLS, so there's some information on that. You can ask for indirect costs. There's an explanatory handout on indirect costs. When I get to that part in the presentation, feel free to jump in and ask questions, but I highly recommend you ask for indirect costs. You are eligible to do that. There is an activity statistics guide. If you get a grant from us, there are statistics that I need you to keep track of during your grant because I will need to report those statistics to IMLS. Each of these Improving Access grants are a separate report to IMLS for me at the end of your program. So it's somewhat uncomfortable to tell IMLS, oh, by the way, we don't have the statistics you asked for. So make sure you understand going into the grant what you'll need to track. And for day-to-day management of the grant, we do have a reimbursement request checklist. Again, if you get a grant, keep that checklist handy. I will not reimburse you without the documentation listed on that checklist. So you can save yourself an email from me if you review that checklist. And there are finally some required evaluation survey questions if you're training the public, especially. And this is formal training, not drop-in, not a program. So you can see what those are. And again, those are something that I'm going to include in that report to IMLS. So I really appreciate that. So who's eligible? If you watched the application webinar, I'm repeating a little bit, but in case I have new people. To be eligible, you must be established as one of the following: a public library, an academic library, or a library cooperative. You must be eligible at the time of application. And within those three types, you must have paid library staff. You must have a regular public schedule of library services. You must have a dedicated facility. You must have an annual budget with funds reserved for library materials and services. You must do multi-type library cooperation. We typically consider this like participating in MelCat or doing interlibrary loan. If you're a public library, you must be lawfully established and currently eligible for state aid. And if you're an academic library, you must be a public or nonprofit college or university currently accredited by the Higher Learning Commission. So if you feel you don't fit part of that, give me a call after the webinar and we can talk about your eligibility. So the priorities are to improve access to services and information in the areas of literacy, local history and special collections, and digital inclusion. And I have a typo here. It should say 3 areas. Ongoing capacity will be considered. For example, Josh mentioned he wanted to make digital literacy more available to community members that use their library who aren't students. However, operational expenditures are not allowable. So for the literacy priority, we're looking at a range of literacy topics, not just kind of the typical idea of literacy in a public library with children's and summer reading. We are also interested in financial literacy. We're interested in digital literacy. We're interested in ESL, adult literacy, health literacy. For those of you who really want to do training around digital literacy and may purchase laptops or equipment to help them with that training, I would think what you're going to apply for is a literacy grant. There's some possible options here. One of those we listed actually was financial or digital literacy training. For digital inclusion, we're looking at things that will increase access to the internet and to online materials for people who have limited access now. Sometimes I see a proposal here for we want to include more e-content. And that doesn't help someone who doesn't have the capacity to get online easily. So we're looking for something that focuses very tightly on people who have limited access to get online and how you can address that. You may have a reason to include additional e-content materials, but your program can't be just e-content materials. And for special collections, we do allow digitization. We also allow preservation of items, but there needs to be a focus on documenting and preserving local history, experiences, and identities of your community. Some examples we have is the preservation and promotion of an existing collection, collaborating to bring together a themed collection that would expose your community to materials that are available in a different way. If you have existing digital materials and they aren't, the metadata is not to the standard for inclusion in the Digital Public Library of America, you can apply to redo your metadata so that the materials are more accessible. So any questions about those 3 guidelines before I talk about budgets more? Nobody.
Karen,
Yes, sir.
can you go over the requirements regarding the TIPA? You mentioned that last time.
Yes. If you are an academic library, SIPA does not apply to you. If you are a public library, you have 2 options. You don't buy anything that accesses or the internet or is internet access with the federal money, or you comply with SIPA. It does not matter where they use the device. Sometimes people will say, well, I'm checking out a laptop to them and they're taking it home. Doesn't matter. You paid for the laptop with federal funds. The laptop can access the internet. It needs to be filtered.
Thank you.
It's the same with hotspots. If you get hotspots, a lot of hotspot providers um, will allow you to set up your data access so that it is filtered. So then when people take the hotspot home, what they're getting is filtered access. That said, you don't need to filter after the grant period is over, but you do have to do it during the grant period. So it's for that, it's a little easier to be a college library. Um, The digitization proposals, I do highly recommend you listen to the recording of Biz's presentation on April 11th. Anybody who would like the link to that, just pop me an email. We haven't posted it on the webpage yet because we're still getting it captioned, but I can give you the link to the uncaptioned recording if you'd like. Do keep in mind for digitization, you do have to provide project content to the Digital Public Library of America. And the proposal must include documentation of copyright permission or that materials are outside of copyright. That is where we have the biggest eligibility problem with digitization proposals is we get blanket statements from the applicant saying, we own this material, so we have blanket permission to digitize it and provide it online. We want you to document that. Just a blanket statement will not be good enough. And some donated collections include materials that are copyrighted, and the person who donated it doesn't have the capacity to waive the original intellectual property owner's copyright. So this is something where you really might want to talk to Biz just to make sure you're on the right track. I didn't realize I included this many on the focus. So one thing to keep in mind, the grant program focus is to improve access to information for a community and how that increases the reach of the library to those new users. From what you guys said when we first started, that sounds like you guys are doing all right with that. If some of the things that we've talked about so far and we're in the applications webinar, if you're thinking about your proposal and you're not sure how you fit with those priorities and that focus, again, feel free to call me and we can talk about it. And I can make some suggestions that if you aren't fitting well within the priorities that might help pull your idea in, we would like to see you apply. So I'm happy to talk with you and work out what might make your proposal fit better. So you can ask for $5,000 to $25,000. Funds are dispersed on a reimbursement basis only, and reimbursement requests are required at least quarterly. I have started asking for quarterly reimbursements because the longer you wait, the more your documentation gets mixed up. And it also helps you and me make sure that you're staying on track. If you're not using as much of your budget as you expected, that gives me a heads up and I can call you up and say, is there anything going on that I can help with? My goal at the end of the year is that you will spend all of your money. So I won't be looking for how can an LM keep money back? I will be looking for, is there any way I can help you deal with whatever issue you might have with expending your funds? Some rules. You can't spend money on lobbying. You can't spend grant money on general advertising, meaning the library is great. Come visit the library. You can advertise your project. You can say, the library is now launching Digital Learn. Come to the library and learn about improving your computer skills. That would be perfectly acceptable. Salaries, supplies, services, or materials that are not directly in support of grant activities, meaning you cannot do the project without them. If you can't say that about some costs, they may not be allowable. There is also a tech company ban. It's primarily Huawei and one other company, but also their subsidiaries. You can't buy electronics equipment from those companies. Also any video equipment. If you're going to buy laptops from Dell, I wouldn't be real concerned about this. But if you see a better deal on a manufacturer name that you don't recognize, you may want to check sam.gov to see if that company is excluded. And what you would do is search by the company name and then see if they have an exclusion in their record. If they do, you'd have to purchase from a different manufacturer. This isn't your vendor, it's not Amazon, it's who manufactured the device. Food and furnishings are frankly quite problematic, and we recommend you don't plan on providing food or purchasing furnishings with LSTA funds. I have had some people get food through with some very creative ideas. For example, apparently, if you're with my Summer Quick Grant, Oreos make a great way to teach people about the phases of the moon. I did allow that, but in general, you can't do snacks or meals. Some items that won't be funded are standard library operations. Occasionally I get asked, we need to upgrade our ILS. We want to do an RFID project. We consider those standard library operations, and we would not fund those. And I see Isabella has asked if a mobile laptop cart is considered furnishings. No, that would be a fine purchase for the grant. And it would be necessary, especially if you're going to not have a specific space dedicated. You might be moving things around. You might be taking it out to a community center. We can't have you supplant local funds or staff, meaning you had the money in your budget for this staff time or these laptops, but you found out about the grant and you're like, well, okay, we'll just have the grant pay for that. And then we can roll over our local funds. It might be hard for me to figure out if you're doing that. However, it is something that is unallowable. And if that issue does come up, I would be uncomfortable to have that conversation with you. Capital expenditures are not allowed with Institute of Museum and Library Services funding. Capital expenditures are allowed under some federal grants, but not IMLS LSTA funds. In their authorizing legislation, they are specifically precluded from doing capital expenditures. You may need to do capital costs to do your project. For example, maybe you want to do a Wi-Fi extension to an outdoor area where you're doing programming. If you need an electrician to come in and install, electrical outlets, that would be something you'd have to cover locally. We could help you with the expenditures for the Wi-Fi service, but not for anything relating to construction or electricians. So some ideas of what else falls under standard library operations. Like I said, automation, basic collection development, equipment replacement. By equipment replacement, I mean our computer area is getting old. We would just like to replace our computers. That's going to be considered equipment replacement and wouldn't be allowed. Also, requests for upgrades, collections, or equipment that are new to your organization but are not integral to the grant activities will be considered standard library operations and won't be granted. And by that, I mean, say you've got a budget of $20,000 and you go, well, I can ask for 25. We would also like to have an additional collection of books that could be considered supportive of the project. But if you aren't going to use them as part of the project, that would be considered not integral to the grant. Supplanting versus supplementing, a rule of thumb you can look at for this is, like I said, are the activities and materials already in your budget? Then that's supplanting local funds. Are the activities new to your budget? Is this going to be a new thing for a staff member to set this program up? Then their salary costs for the grant activities and setting up a program are allowable. They would not be supplanting, they would be supplementing. Capital expenditures essentially are construction or renovation of buildings or vehicles. So they're quite strict on that. So, be aware, for example, with the ARPA funds that we received through IMLS, some people asked for exterior lockers. They had to do the electrical wiring and the cement work for the base with local funds. So budgets. When you do the application, there is some brief information in the application where we say, how much money are you expecting to ask for? What will be any in kind or cash match you may be providing. But the budget itself is a separate document. It's an Excel sheet that is on the grant page. And we require you to use that form. So when I'm looking at all of the application budgets, they each look the same. I can compare apples to apples to apples. If you have any trouble getting the form to work, just give me a call. And then you will upload that Excel sheet into the online grant application when you've completed it. So the things you can include in your budget, you need to include things that are allowable. There's several pages of information on allowable costs in the application packet. It needs to be allocable, and this is grant terminology that I don't hear anywhere else. So this is jargon, but what it basically means is you can say, I have data access plans with T-Mobile, but you can see I'm going to add 5 laptops for my DigiLearn project. And here are the 5 data access plans that go to those laptops. So you can point on that bill to the things that are expenses for the grant activities versus the rest. You can allocate them. If it's something that you can't allocate, that might be something you want to use under indirect costs. For example, we don't allow office supplies because it's hard for you to say how much of the office supplies did you use for the grant versus how much did you use for something else. And it also has to be necessary. So like I say, that additional collections support might be nice, but is it necessary? If something is determined after the expenditures are made that it's not allowable, be aware that you'll be responsible for those costs. I would like to say I can cover your costs if you've done something that's unallowable and just have that be an FYI for the future. Unfortunately, I can't do that. So if you have any questions at all, you are absolutely welcome to reach out because I don't want to have anybody be in that situation. Again, on a lockable, you have to be able to say either I used all of it for the grant or I can point to how much I used for the grant and I can document that on the invoices. And then again, necessary. Did you really need that? For example, even if it would help for a digital inclusion online training class to have tables, tables in and of themselves aren't a specific purchase for a digital learning class. So that's something we would expect you to purchase as part of your general operating expenditures. So when you write your budget, you're going to give a description of the specific items or activities in the narrative column. I'll show you a copy of the grant budget spreadsheet. But you do have a narrative column in there where you explain, I expect staff will spend 3 hours a week getting ready for classes. They're going to do 3 classes a week that are an hour each. So that's 6 hours. I expect we'll have the classes up and running by 3 months into the grant. So I estimate that I'm going to need, say, 100 hours of staff time. The staff member makes this much an hour. So then you have an explanation of your staff time amount for your budget. If you include match funds, be aware that match funds must follow the same federal allowable cost and documentation rules. That is one reason why, even if you include match funds in your budget, I am not going to put them in the federal report to try and relieve you of some of the documentation rules. However, if you know you're going to spend local funds as well as the LSTA funds, it does help your reviewers to know that you understand the totality of the project costs. I'm just not going to report that part to the feds. The budget items must match the proposal activities. So you can't ask for a database that doesn't relate to the class activities you might be doing. And the proposal activities must match the budget items. So these sound kind of obvious, but essentially, if the peer reviewer is reading through your project description and says, all right, you're going to do activity A, activity B, activity C, and you mentioned you're going to buy laptops. People can check laptops out. You're going to digitize a historic collection of maps, and you're going to be using a service that specializes in handling fragile materials, we would then expect to see laptops or a service provider in your budget. But if we see those in your budget, we also expect you to discuss them in the project. So they should match hand in hand. What can you ask for in terms of budget categories? You can ask for salaries, wages, and benefits, and you absolutely can include benefits. So no worry there. You can ask for consultant fees. This is a very narrow scope category. You're not likely to use it. A consultant is someone who gives you advice, not someone who provides a service. So most of the time, if you're hiring someone, it's going to be a service. You can include travel, and you can include travel at the federal rate, which is lovely because it's much higher than the state rate in most local rates. You can buy supplies and materials. You can buy equipment. The difference between supplies and materials is merely the cost. Equipment is something that costs more than $5,000 for a single item. Supplies and materials is everything else. You can buy services, data access plan, a warranty, someone to come in and do digitization for you. If it's something that you purchase for a set period of time, like it was cheaper to buy the data access plan if you agreed to 12 months, you can only get reimbursed for the months that happen during the grant period. So if it takes you a couple of months to get things up and running, and then your first year of your data access plan is January to December, your grant contract will end September 30th. So October, November, and December will be a local cost. I will only pay you the first 9 months. So does that make sense? I don't see anybody with a question. And finally, there's indirect. Indirect is the federal government's acknowledgement that it costs you time and money to do a grant over and above what you can allocate to the grant. You're going to be paying for insurance on your building. You're going to be paying your electric bill. You're going to have general office supplies that end up getting used on the grant. That stuff falls under indirect. If you have an approved indirect rate agreement with a federal agency, you can use that, and you have to provide a copy of the current rate agreement as part of the application. That's typically only going to be an academic library. That's something that universities do. If you don't have an indirect cost rate agreement, which is going to be most public libraries, you can ask for 10% of everything except equipment. This doesn't increase how much you can ask for. So if you've already asked for 25,000, you don't have any room left in the budget for indirect. But if you ask for 20,000 and you can then add $2,000 in indirect for that 10% de minimis rate. Any questions on the budget categories before I keep going? So salaries and benefits, here's an area where you really do need to be careful of supplanting versus supplementing. You will need to document time spent per hour, per pay period, per staff member for reimbursement. Some people's payroll system provides enough information that a copy of their payroll report is enough. If not, I do have a fairly simple form on the website that you can use where you fill it out. You do have to show all of the hours worked. So if you have a staff member who works 35 hours a week and they're spending 5 hours a week on the grant, you need to show all 35 hours a week when you submit that form. And finally, you're going to be reimbursed at the same salary you pay your existing staff. The first time you submit a reimbursement request that includes salary costs, you need to include something to document that that is an approved rate, a union agreement, an approved budget for your board, a staff employee manual that shows which job positions are which salary rate. You only need to do that the first time. And then after that, you can just submit the timekeeping report. And the reason for that is the federal government doesn't want to see a grant where people magically all of a sudden make $500 an hour when it comes to grant expenditures. So consultants versus services, like I said, a consultant gives you advice, a strategic planning consultant would be a consultant. Um, Someone who's going to do web hosting for you, is going to write curriculum for you, maybe do programming in the library for you, teach a class. Those are all going to be services. Travel, like I said, you get to use the federal rate. And the federal rate also breaks things down by city. So if the city's expensive, the rate goes up, which is lovely because state of Michigan doesn't work that way. Equipment versus supplies. The equipment is something that costs more than $5,000 per item. Do be aware that that is something that will have to be approved in advance by IMLS in writing. So if you change your budget on the fly during your grant year and want to buy something that is equipment, please do not purchase it until I have confirmed you have approval for it. If you have asked for it in your original budget, I will have already arranged the IMLS approval at the point you're notified that you were approved for a grant. So you will get your grant contract and a copy of the written approval from IMLS for that item. So it doesn't matter if it's computers or technical equipment, the determination is cost. The indirect cost rate, I've got a little bit more information here about it. I would like to see everyone ask for it if you have room for it in your budget. And for example, if you're like, well, I don't have room for 10%, say you asked for $24,000 and 10% of that is $2,400. There's only 1,000 left. Ask for that 1,000 in indirect. That way, if you end up spending less than you expected, I can work with you to revise your grant and let you recoup perhaps more of your costs through a change in the indirect rate. What I can't do is add indirect to your approved budget after you apply. So I really would like to see that from everybody. If you're interested in negotiating a rate, we cannot do it. We are a pass-through entity. Only federal agencies can negotiate a rate. So IMLS also, since they're a small agency, they will not negotiate a direct rate with you either. They will only accept a rate that has been negotiated with another agency. So reminder that indirect costs are part of your total budget. And there is some information on indirect costs at the webpage. I'll show you that when I'm done with the presentation. The budget narrative should include enough information that your peer reviewers understand how you came up with the money. So we're not expecting to see salaries, $10,000, staff time. We're expecting to see a particular staff member is going to spend 10 hours a week on the grant, and this is how that 10 hours breaks down. 10 laptops for youth coding activities at $500 each. That is where people tend to fall down a little bit in their budget, is not explaining how they came up with their numbers well. So questions before I show you what the materials look like on the website? So Heidi's asking to clarify, if we have a part-time employee who works 20 hours a week and we add 10 hours a week for the grant, yes, we would fund those hours, no problem at all. That's not supplanting your local funds. If she's spending 10 hours or he is spending 10 hours a week for those grant activities, that would be fine. Alrighty. If you don't have any questions right now, I'm going to screen share the webpage and show you where the documentation is.
Karen, I have a question about
Sure.
the outcome-based evaluation.
Mhm.
Um, I'm not not very clear on that or what it would look like for my project.
Mhm.
I'm kind of imagining maybe doing like a focus group. Could we request is funding to like pay focus group participants, is that an allowable expense?
That's a good question. Well, you can't provide snacks. Um, Let's see. That's an interesting question. I would contact our program officer and ask.
Okay.
So, Annie, can you send me an email, Annie, so I have your email address
Sure.
and I can ask Madison and get back with you on that? Essentially, the difference between evaluation in general and outcome-based evaluation is IMLS isn't the only one that uses this. This is fairly common now throughout the nonprofit world and federal grants, is we have a tendency to say 50 people showed up to story time. It was wonderful. We had 50 people show up and everybody said they loved it. An outcome-based evaluation says 50 people showed up and then we asked all of them, we asked a selection of them. You can do spot evaluations. You're not required to have everyone who participates return an evaluation. Um, maybe when some of the parents come back in for the next story time, you can ask them, did you read to your kid more this last week? Are you more comfortable using library materials with your child? What they're looking for is a change in behavior, a change in knowledge, something where you had an impact on the participant, and then they then were able to do something differently in a way that would improve their ability to work with their child, their ability to apply for a job. Do you understand setting up an email account? And if their answer before they started the class was no, and their answer is yes afterwards, you have an outcome. They have learned how to set up their own email, and you can count that as outcome-based evaluation.
Thank you for
So
that clarification. I'm still struggling though how this relates to like the digital projects or like digitization projects, because the goal of these is not necessarily to teach them something, it's just to make information more accessible or available.
you need to have some aspect, and this is difficult if the majority of your project um, is going to be behind the scenes. But for something like that, we will accept. We're going to evaluate people who use it later and say, do you know more about your community's history? Um, are you more likely to use our historic collections now that you have been exposed to this through maybe an outreach event or something like that? Um, if you're planning on that and it's legitimate that it will happen after your grant activities, I think that's acceptable.
Okay, thank you.
Not everything can happen neatly within that year, but our expectation, if the expectation is you're going to continue to evaluate um, your activities after the grant program is done, maybe give me a heads up 6 months or a year later and when things went great, here are some of our numbers, and I could turn around and share them with IMLS, that would be fine. So this is our main page that I referenced in the presentation, michigan.gov/LSTA. There's some general background information about IMLS and the Library of Michigan. And as you go down, you'll see the Improving Access to Information Grant Program. I show it to you this way just because I don't have a direct, easy address to tell you for the grants page. So if you go to the grants page, presumably all of you have seen this since you signed up for the webinar. What I want to show you is as we come down, there's a section called Forms and Documents. These are all the things that relate to the grant program, both for applying and for managing an active grant. So this is the information packet for digital inclusion and literacy. This is the one for local history and special collections. Here are the grant admin manuals. This is the current one. This is the one for next year. There's very limited difference between the two. The SIPA form and the certifications and assurances are one document that has to be submitted with either of those applications. So for the SIPA form, you fill out that page for either I don't have to apply, or excuse me, I don't have to do filtering, or I do and I'm going to. That's one page. The next page is the beginning of the certifications and assurances. You need to put your library name at the top of that page. And then the final page are the signatures for a grant contract should you be awarded. So I did want to show you this. For that form, you need to fill out 3 pages of however many it is. I think it's 7 pages total. And they must be complete. That will get your application thrown out if they are not complete. And be very careful that you upload the final signed version. Sometimes people have passed it around and they accidentally upload the unsigned version. And I cannot accept that after the application deadline. So just to show you real quick, this is the first page, and it is a 7-page document. For SIPA, you need to fill that out completely. The authorized representative is not always the library director, so be careful of that. It's whoever has the formal legal authority to sign contracts for the library. So it may be your board chair. So FYI, you need to fill out the top of this page here, date, applicant library, the applicant library name. And then on this page, you need to have all 4 signatures present. If someone has more than one role, they are the fiscal agent and they are the grant administrator, they need to sign on both lines so we know that. So please make sure that when you upload this, that you have uploaded the correct version with all the final signatures. Every now and then I do have to reject someone's application for that, and I really hate to do that. And then as we were talking about in the presentation, this is the budget spreadsheet. And what you'll do is save this with your library name as part of the file name, and you're going to type in the gray fields. If it's not a gray field, it's either a calculation or it's something where we've included the text for you already. This will expand. This is where you can say 10 hours of youth services staff time to plan and implement story time for neurodivergent youth. And I'm like losing my, I left a word out. So you get the idea. You can expand that. And you can say they make $20 an hour. And we're going to do this for 40 weeks. That's $800 in staff time. If you would prefer to not have a lot of text in each budget narrative field, you can copy and then insert more lines if you'd like to do that. So then you've got an option there for, say, the director's time. Some people that helps them plan better, but there should be enough here in the narrative for us to understand how you came up with your amounts and your costs. So then when you get to the bottom, you have the option here of including your indirect cost rate. And then you get your total LSTA amount. You have total match if you chose to include it in column F. And then you have your project total. So this may end up being fairly long if you're going to include a lot of these. If you have a fairly simple project in terms of purchasing, it may only be a couple of lines. So if this makes sense, then you save it with your local library name. Please do that. Please also put your library name here so that if for some reason you forgot to change the name of the file, and I can at least see from this cell here whose budget it is. Because I do save the budget off separately so that I can manipulate it as an Excel sheet. Any questions on the spreadsheet for the budget? Isabella does ask, do we have to include salaries and wages? Only if you want to. These are all, you basically can pick which budget categories you want to use, but that is an option if you want it. I'm not going to save that then. And then if you do submit a digitization proposal, this is a rights assessment template for copyright. And then if you're like, well, maybe I'll include salaries, maybe I won't. What's the timekeeping report that I might have to use? That's right here. And it's fairly simple. If this is something that's clearly obvious from your payroll system, you can just give me that. Otherwise, you're just going to put in the dates of the pay week, the hours they worked regular, the hours they worked LSTA, the total, times pay rate, times fringe benefits. The employee signs it, the supervisor signs it, and that's it. And you can stock this up or add rows and just submit it quarterly if you like. Alrighty, one last thing then as we get to the end of the hour. This link opens an application for the literacy and digital inclusion priority. This link opens up the local history or special collections priority application. And this link, you return to an application that you've saved or submit a reimbursement request or report if you have an active grant. If you click on open an application to go back to something that you've already been working on, it won't do that. It will open up a new application. So when you first start an application, the first time you use our grant system, you will set up a username and password, and then you use that to log in to return in an application, and then you can pull up your unsubmitted materials and keep working on them, save them, go back to them. If you have used the system in the past, you can continue to use that same account. So when you open an application, you can just log in with your current account, and then everything is together for you of all your previous applications. And a final note, when you submit either an application or a report for an active grant, you will get an email from the system that says it's been submitted. If you don't receive that email, double check with me and make sure that it came through. Sometimes people have got to the stage where they have checked their final entries and they didn't click submit. So it's still hanging out there and it hasn't come through as a submitted application. So look for that email from the grant system that says, this is your grant application number, it's been submitted. You'll hear from Library of Michigan staff soon. So any other questions? I took us right to 2:59. Nobody? Well, if you have questions while you're working on proposals, I hope to hear from you. The grant application is due at 5 p.m. on Friday, May 31st. And I did reference making sure that your application, or excuse me, your signature sheet is correct. If you apply by noon on Wednesday of that week, I will double check and make sure your requirements are correct and give you the opportunity to fix it if they're not. If you submit without the correct signatures at 4:30 on Friday, I'm not likely to have a chance to double check it quickly enough. So if you're at all concerned about making sure things are correct when you submit, try and submit by Wednesday at noon instead of Friday at 5, and I'll give you an opportunity to make any corrections then. Alrighty, it's 3 o'clock. For those that wanted to talk about a digital literacy project, I have Carrie and Isabella. I'll look at my email to see if anyone else has contacted me about that, and I'll set up a meeting about that. So thank you everyone for your time today, and I really hope I see a proposal from everybody.